So last time we got the new truss rod cover made and fitted. We replaced the nut for a much nicer tusk one. And we also spent quite a bit of time rubbing this whole thing down and grain filling it. Now I've left this for a day or so. I put 2 coats of grain filler on and this wood seems to have taken it quite nicely. And the result of that is we don't actually have a huge amount of rubbing down to do, but there is some, and all I've got is a 240 pad on here. And I'm just going to rub kind of with the grain, just to make sure I've smoothed off all of that grain filler and that there's no kind of excess or marks from where I was scraping it on. But that's gone really, really fast. I don't normally show a great deal of rubbing down because I think it's probably the most boring thing in the world to watch, but I think we're going to be through this quite quickly. And we'll just come off the pad for the radiuses, just to make sure we're not sanding any flats into them. And that is kind of pretty much the whole of the body done, as quick as that. Which just leaves the neck to do. Now there's quite a bit of this neck where the grain seems a lot more open, and I'm hoping that I'm not going to have to go in and grain fill again. It feels quite rough where I haven't sanded, but I think that's just because we've raised the grain with that water-based filler. And I'm actually quite happy with that. That feels nice now. And it doesn't appear to have opened that grain up at all. And with that all nicely rubbed down now, we can kind of start to think about getting some finish on this. And the first thing I'm going to need to do is just screw a hook in, so we've got somewhere to hang it up. This is going to be a little bit on the sketchy side because obviously this hook is going in at an angle to the body, not kind of in line with it as it normally would do. So I'm going to leave it like that for the time being. We can get this over to the paint booth and get it hung up. And the first thing I'm going to do with this is just to shoot some kind of thin clear coats onto it. Let that dry for a little while so that we can kind of just rub that down, denib it, get rid of any lumps or bumps that might have developed from getting that lacquer on. And then we can think about actually getting this thing into colour. Okay, so I've just mixed up some lacquer off camera and I ordered clear and I seem to have got amber. At this stage of the game it's not an issue, this is just a sealer coat and it's going to be rubbed down and covered over. So that's not a problem. I'm not sure how this is going to impact my plans further down the line, but it's what we've got. I've got no other lacquer in stock, so I think we're just going to have to go with it. I'm sure it'll be fine. And I've left this about 24 hours to dry off, maybe a little bit longer, and it has flashed off nicely. It won't be fully dry, but it is dry enough for the next step, which is just to kind of remove any kind of fuzziness that has been introduced with these first coats. Even though we had grain filler on here, the application of this lacquer will have raised the grain ever so slightly. So all I need to do is just very quickly flash over, and I've got some 320 wet and dry here, and that will simply just take off all those little nibs that have been raised up. And gives a nice flat surface again. You need to be careful on the corners not to kind of rub straight through, but generally a very quick and straightforward job. The problem you'll get if you don't do this is that the little nibs that have been raised up will attract more finish, and that will kind of make them bigger, and as you go through the process they will just kind of make your finish really, really uneven. So at every stage we will just be knocking this back ever so slightly with a bit of wet and dry until we get to the final coats, which we will then leave to harden fully for probably a few weeks if we get the chance, and then properly flatten them back and polish them to a nice high gloss finish. And then we just need to do exactly the same on the neck. Now I did say that the grain on the central section of this neck was very kind of open pored, but if I give that a quick rub off, I can see that that has been pretty much filled up. There are just some very slight low spots that I can see still shiny against this, but on the whole we're where we need to be, and the subsequent coats of lacquer will kind of fill that up very, very nicely. So just continue, give this a quick flash off, and we can get this back over to the spray booth for the next stage. And somewhat unusually for me, I'm actually going with a solid colour for the back of this guitar and for the back of the neck, and I'm going to go black. And that might seem like something of an unusual choice, but I think when we see what I've got in mind for the top, it'll all start to make a little bit more sense. So I'll get some of this banged in the gun and we'll get a few coats laid down. Okay, so there's a few coats of black sprayed onto that, and it's looking nice. I'm quite happy with this. There is a little bit of a pattern in there of the grain, but it's not kind of in any way deep into that finish, and I'm sure if we give this a quick kind of flat off, we'll work past that quite easily. So happy with the way that this has gone so far. Now, the sharp-eyed amongst you might have noticed that I put a little bit of a run in along here on the first coat. I think I put a second one in just a little bit here as well. I think I just made that paint a little bit too thin, and also this is quite awkward to spray because the strap location is kind of 6 inches down the body, whereas normally it would be at the end of the guitar, so the whole thing would be sat lower on the paint jig, and I think reaching up has made it a little bit harder to do. Probably should have extended my little bit of wire that it's hanging off, but we are where we are. Now you might be wondering what I would do in the situation here with this run, and as you can see I've put several more coats on this. The somewhat surprising to some answer might be that I'm actually not going to do anything at this stage. With the paint still really soft as it was when I put this on, any attempt to do anything with that run would just make things exponentially worse. And although it sounds and seems counterintuitive, the best thing you can do in that situation, from my perspective, is to just leave it. There are some factors you need to take into account. It's run because the paint was quite thin, which means there's a lot of solvent in it. And as that solvent evaporates, that run will become less pronounced. It will kind of sink back into the paint finish. Secondly, as I put more coats on top of this, the paint kind of melts into itself. So that will help that run just flow out ever so slightly and make it less pronounced. And thirdly, once this has dried for a day or so, I can actually go back over it with some kind of quite smooth sandpaper, and I can flat off that area where the run is and kind of make it again less pronounced. Which means that by the time I come to spray my clear coats onto here, there won't be that much of a run evident, which again will flow out once we put more lacquer on top of it, and it will then even itself out to a much greater extent. Once all the clear coats are on and it's all dried up nicely, we can then flat and polish this, and hopefully the run is low enough at that point that we can flat out the lacquer and it won't be at all visible. So while it might seem like an absolute disaster, once you put it on, it really isn't that big of a deal. And before I move on with this, I just want to address a few comments that have come in recently. And the first one, which is a little bit concerning to me, is saying that I don't seem to be enjoying this build very much. And the second one saying that I appear anxious. I am enjoying it. I don't feel anxious. There are some differences obviously with this being a kit, and probably the main one is because it was so far along when I got my hands on it, I don't think I had as much of a plan for this one as I normally would. So to a certain extent, I'm just winging this one, and I think that might be what's coming across as anxiety or a lack of enjoyment. Another factor that might be playing into that is, as many of my regular viewers will know, I work in an educational setting, and at this time of the year is very busy and a little bit stressful. So that might just be kind of translating in the way that I'm coming across on camera. Additionally, I'm breaking in a new camera on this build. My last one died and I've changed brand and type of camera, so I've got a little bit of a learning curve, and that is a little bit stressful because there are always things on a guitar build that if you miss them whilst you're filming, they're gone forever. And that really makes life difficult. Next up, someone asked if you can use oil over aquacoat. I have absolutely no idea. I haven't used a lot of oil finishes in my time, and I've definitely not used one over aquacoat. My gut feeling is probably no, because oil finishes by default kind of penetrate the wood, and if you've got this sort of grain filler in there, that's going to kind of make that not happen quite so much. Could be wrong, I don't know. Perhaps something I need to do an experiment on. Next up, someone suggested that I made a bigger truss rod cover and inlaid my logo into that. Technically, I think that would be kind of next to impossible unless I made like an 8mm thick truss rod cover, which is obviously going to be an issue. The logo that I inlaid on this one was about 3 or 4mm thick, and I'd also need some additional material behind it just so that that truss rod cover wasn't too thin. I think technically the only way that could be done would be to kind of use a CNC cutter perhaps to inlay the logo into a thinner truss rod and then fill it with some kind of resin or something. And on the subject of logos, someone else suggested that I make a separate video going into a much greater detail of how I actually did this one, and I think that's a brilliant idea. So at some point in the future I will be doing that, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. Right, back to the build. Now obviously not having that clear lacquer that I wanted is going to have an impact on the rest of this finishing process, because I don't have the clear lacquer that I'm going to need. However, I have just been in and ordered some, and I'm hoping that it's going to be here within the next few days. So whilst we wait for that, we can get on to the next little bit, which is to delicately remove this masking, because sometimes with a veneer you can kind of pull it up a little bit if you're not careful. But so far we seem to be absolutely fine with this. And I'm just going to take this 240 pad and I'm going to just blend in that edge so we haven't got a step. I'm not actually that bothered about how clean the edge is from this masking, because at some point I am going to spray in a little bit of a black burst around this edge just to give it a little bit more interest and make it look a little bit nicer. But that is all for a little bit down the line, because next up I want to make this top look a little bit more interesting than it currently does by giving it a nice coat of stain. But before I do that, I'm just going to pull out these two bushings. Now I've thought long and hard about what I wanted to do with the top of this guitar, and I had a few ideas and then I kind of went off them and had another one and kind of like that. And then a few weeks ago I was kind of browsing online and I came across a photograph of a Les Paul with a finish that I really liked, and I'm going to have a go at replicating it on here. And that finish is what they're referring to as a purple burst. So it's a purple top with a black burst edge, and I think that will look absolutely stunning on this Flying V. So to that end I've got some nice purple water-based stain, and we'll just make sure that this top is nice and clean and give it a coat or two, see what we can get it to look like. I'll just stick some gloves on for this because I would look weird with purple hands at work tomorrow. And I'm just going to use a bit of folded shop towel. Give this a nice good shake up. Load plenty of stain on, and then it's that kind of now or never moment where there really is no going back. Now I appreciate that there's a very strong chance that this isn't going to be to everyone's taste. Apologies to all those that hate it already, but the one thing I have found out whilst been doing this YouTube stuff is that there's absolutely no point in trying to please everyone. And if you don't like a particular finish, you just have to wait until the next one and maybe you'll like that one a bit more. I think it is worth remembering that this stuff goes on an awful lot darker initially than it will be once it's dried. And then just get a bit into that cavity as well. And I think for a first coat that is looking quite nice. Obviously we're going to have to let that dry up and give it another coat just to make sure we're getting the coverage we need. It's perhaps not showing up as well as it might in the camera, but that really is showing that grain in the top. So far that is going very well, very happy with it. Obviously I don't have any more lacquer to go any further with this once the staining's done. We're going to have to wait for that to arrive, so I think this is a pretty good place to leave this episode. So I'll be back in a few days time when hopefully we can progress this a little bit further. Until then, don't forget to hit like if you've enjoyed this, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye bye.